The third speaker is Dr. Ömer Özgül. He is going to talk to us about the longing for Hajj in Sufism culture. The example of Abdurrahim Gubari in the context of his book Menasik el-Hajj. Ömer Özgül is from the Presidency of Religious Affairs, head of the appointment department. Thank you very much, distinguished participants. Distinguished participants in the meeting room, distinguished participants listening to our speeches from the online platform. I'm going to talk to you about Abdurrahman Gubari and the Minasik al-Hajj book. In this book, he wrote the book in a prison. This is important for us because that's one of the reasons why we chose this topic. So I'm going to present you this paper with God's permission. Both Professor Dr. Ömer Yılmaz and Dr. Mehmet Faruk Çiftçi talked to us about similar topics, and I'm going to continue their discussion. The perception of the Sufi scholars to Hajj. Niyazi Misri has a poem about this, has a verse about this. To be a person of a mature person, you need wisdom. Actually, Hajj is the ibadat which has the highest number of symbols in the 5 pillars of Islam. Kaaba is a symbol, Arafat is a symbol. All the stops of the Hajj, all the stages of Hajj have a symbolic meaning. In today's world, the pilgrims, the Hajjis, think that they have become a pilgrim only after fulfilling the physical conditions. But this is a mistaken understanding. In the Sufism classics, actually Hajj is given a lot of importance to. In order to make best use of time, I'm going to give you one example. El-Ruma by Nurasul Sajram, he defines Ihram as follows. When you go to Mikat, you wash your body with water and you wash your heart with tebe. And when you when you strip yourself of your clothes, you strip your heart of hatred and bad feelings. And you when you unbutton your shirt, you actually get rid of the earthly knots in your heart. So this is how he perceives and defines Ihram. As far as I remember, there are 19 more descriptions of Hajj in that book, and in every description, he describes us the feelings that a true pilgrim should have. Sufi says that Lebbeik Allahum and Lebbeik, and this is the tembe after you obey the invitation of the God. You no longer obey the invitation of the earthly things and the nafs, because this is a fight against the nafs as well. And you are aware that you are in the presence of the God. You should be loyal and true to his word and obey his word, and you should never extend your hands to any earthly thing with desire and with greed. And you should make sure that your heart is never filled with such greedy feelings or such feelings of hatred in this regard. Hajj is actually a travel, first of all, because in the Sufism culture, it is actually one of the ways where Murshid builds up the belief. So in this travel, chatting, sohbet or halvet could be one of the means that you can use. In this respect, it is like a stagnant water if you live in one single place during the course of your life. That's why Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, they always traveled, and travel in their life is an important part. And the most important travel is the travel to Beytullah, Kabe. In Sufism, there are manzils and menazim in Seyr-ül Sülük. In this respect, Hajj is actually this name is considered as a travel. For instance, it is actually meeting the beloved one when you reach Kaaba. In this respect, actually, Hajj is also considered as Sefer il-Billah. It is a travel to God. It is a travel where at the end of which you meet God, you meet Allah, and you. So the travel, the physical travel of Hajj and the spiritual travel of Sufis are very much associated with one another in this respect. I don't have time to go talk to you about the details. When my paper is printed, you can read the details later on. And the contribution of the Sufi scholars to Hajj literature. Menazul Hajj books are among such contributions. The first one of such books is Kitab el-Efsad Mensaj by Ahmedi Fakiri. And the most popular one is the Tuhfetul Haremin by Nabi. This is the most popular Sufi contribution in the Hajj literature. And another example, which is also very much interesting for me, is by Sayyid Ibrahim Hanifi Bey, who died in 1802. In his book, he actually traveled, he started his journey from the Ottoman land, and then he talks to us about the conditions, social conditions during his travel, and he covers 36 stops. He stops by 36 places, and whenever he stops by a place, he writes a poem about the geographical locations of that place or the Islamic scholars who lived in that place. So he defines these 36 spots which he covered during his journey to Hajj. And Kabe-e-Name were also among the books written by Sufi scholars about Hajj. Abdurrahim Mukabe is the first person who has written such a book called Kabe-e-Name. In his book, he also talks or the reparations introduced to Kabe. He talks about the history of Kabe, how the Zamzam water first appeared. In such Kabe-Name books include valuable information about such details. As I mentioned, in our Ilmihal books, we divide the ibadah into 3 groups. The ibadahs which require body performance, or ibadahs which require the use of goods and charity. But Sufism, for Sufism, this is not enough, because they say that heart or spiritual things should be included when you perform an ibadat. In Esrarul Hajj, books that they have written, we have such books written by Ghazali or some other Sufi scholars as well. There are also Ediye type books as well, which are actually each include the prayers that you may need to recite during the performance of Hajj. We have such example prayers as well. And another type of books written by Sufi are called Menasikul Hajj. There are a lot of such books, Menasikul Hajj books. But what is specific to Abdurrahman Gubari is he is the first person who has written such books, and he has written this book when he was in a prison. This is a specific characteristic of this book, and it is a book written in verse. And Abdurrahman Gubari was born in Akşehir, and he is a Sufi scholar. He is also a poet and Hattat as well. And Gubari means actually a person who has undergone madrasa training, and he was also trained by a madrasa as well. For instance, he has written the whole Yasin verse when he was in the word of Yasin. So he is an artist in this regard. He is calligraphist, and he's a very skilled one, and that's why he has also used this word Gubari in his title. We all know the Sheikh Galip popular verses. Actually, the original verse was first written by Abdurrahman Gubari, and Sheikh Galip wrote this popular verse as a reference to what Abdurrahman Gubari has first written. But Sheikh Galip's verses became more popular than those of Gubari, and Gubari recommends that you don't be fooled. You are actually the whole universe itself, and he became popular with such verses, and among the poets, Gubari was a very popular poet back in his time. Before he completed his Seyr-i Sülük together with Kanuni Sultan Süleyman, he actually joined a campaign to Mecca and Medina, and then he joins the madrasa again, and he completes his Seyr-i Sülük, and then he works in constructing another Medina. Then he goes to Mecca. Then he comes back to Anatolia. When he comes back to Anatolia, in Kütahya, he serves Şehzade Çelebi, and he becomes a scholar, a teacher to Şehzade. When there were clashes between Yavuz and his sons to rule, to ascend to the throne, he was put in jail because he was the teacher of the son of the Sultan, who was also claiming the throne. So in this respect, he actually wrote 2 poems about Kaaba, and he also wrote another work in verse, which is Menasik el-Hajj. When he was writing this work in verse, I would like to recite you the introductory verses of this Menasik el-Hajj. His objective is to make sure that the pilgrimage should be performed in such a way that the benefits that you may get out of pilgrimage are not compromised. When he was writing this Menasik el-Hajj, he was in jail. That's why he had longing for his children, and he had longing for Kaaba as well. And when he was talking about Iram, he was actually praying to God to be saved from this prison. And when he was actually writing another chapter, he also remembers that he's in jail. So he wrote this book in such a environment that he describes very well the suffering that he had to endure and the longing that he had for the Hajj. I'm going to give you some examples from the book. Don't push people who shave their heads, and when a man actually covers their head, they will need a moment to shave their heads. So when there are also other chapters in the books talking about the conditions of the Hajj. These are some verses that I am reading right now from the book. In those books, he says that the condition for Hajj are nisab. So in those books, actually, I was very much impressed by the book. And if you are unaware of the full meaning of Hajj, then you should read these verses, which he's such a good writer that I actually admired his skills. And the first thing that caught my attention was as follows, because these examples are about the sufferings that he had to endure when he was in jail. Mecca is the place for Kudul Adab. And these are the verses from his book again. Read. So these are the verses. I don't want to read all of them to you. I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm going to wrap up right now. In jail, he actually wrote a lot of good things about Hanefi fiqh. He didn't get any help from anyone else, and he, unlike our generation, he didn't copy and paste, and that's why he actually is quite an admirable person in this regard. Menasikul Hajj is actually a book that should be studied by the theologians, but instead of them, that most of the time it was studied by people who are specialized in literature. So only the literature dimension of the book was studied in detail. But in my opinion, theologians should study this book as well. We are in the process. Maybe the General Directorate of Hajj and Umrah should start a library on Hajj and Hajj-related works. Maybe this book can be abridged or simplified, or a person who is skilled in literature or in poetry, they can write another Menasikul Hajj in verse. Thank you very much for your attention.